Today we're going to go over the testing involved before a safe transfusion can be provided to a patient. I'm Chris Reeder, an ASCP certified specialist in blood banking. I'm currently serving as the IRL supervisor over at Life South in Gainesville. I've listed our course objectives on this slide and the following one as well. Please read through these and keep them in mind while you're viewing the presentation. We're going to return to these at the end to make sure that you've learned what I hope you're going to learn by the end of this presentation. Again, more objectives. This is the rest of them for this lecture. Please read through them before you view the rest of the lecture and keep them in mind as you're going through it. The purpose of pre-transfusion testing is to ensure safe transfusion of blood products with an acceptable survival rate by avoiding the likelihood of a hemolytic transfusion reaction. I'm going to take this moment to offer this. The safest blood transfusion is the one that's not given at all. Blood transfusion is effectively an organ transplant. There's a number of immune mechanisms that you're going to learn about later that make blood transfusion dangerous, so it should be reserved for critical need only. Previously known as the American Association of Blood Banks, and then simply AABB, and now the Association for the Advancement of Blood and Biotherapies, AABB accredits most blood processing facilities and many transfusion services. They provide the standard against which transfusion medicine care is provided for patients. AABB has outlined in their standards specific requirements for pre-transfusion testing. We're going to be using these standards to address what is required for safe transfusion. I've listed the general steps of pre-transfusion testing here as outlined by AABB. We're going to go through these in more detail over the subsequent slides, but briefly, we start with a transfusion request from a physician, which must be positively identified against the patient and which components or tests are needed. And then we receive a blood sample, which must also be positively identified to ensure that we have blood from the correct patient. And then we perform testing on the recipient, but we also need to test the blood that we will be providing, and that doesn't necessarily need to take place simultaneously or even on the same day. Once testing is complete, we need to select appropriate components, perform more testing to ensure compatibility, and then label the components for transfusion. And then finally, we have the tech's role in issuance of blood for transfusion. The first thing that has to happen is that the physician must request the blood. This can be done electronically, but there's often some form of paper trail. The request, often termed REC, must display enough information so that the patient can be identified. This is intentionally vague, and many hospital transfusion services will define what is required for positive identification. A major cause of transfusion-associated fatalities is clerical error, resulting in incorrect ABO groupings and the transfusion of incompatible blood. The transfusion process begins and ends with positive patient identification. Most commonly, positive identification consists of the patient's first and last name, and either their date of birth or some unique medical record number, or occasionally a social security number. There are often specified alternatives when any information is not available, such as in a trauma setting. Electronically recorded information is preferable to handwritten, simply because there tend to be fewer errors, and the text is generally more legible. The next step is that a blood sample must be collected. Again, positive patient identification is a crucial part of this step. If you have the wrong patient's blood in the tube, you drastically increase the odds of giving incompatible blood. The patient must either be tagged with an armband or must clearly state his or her full name and date of birth or some other identifying information. This information must be recorded on the patient's sample while in the presence of the patient. This information may be recorded on a computer-generated label. The date of collection must also be recorded, and there must be a way of identifying the collector. Most often this is done by having the collector initial the sample. Many hospitals also implement a verifier, a second employee who ensures that the patient clearly spoke his or her name and the collector appropriately recorded this information. However, the transfusion service is always responsible for the legibility, completion, and accuracy of a request and sample. Both the REC and the sample must match exactly. If the REC is inaccurate, it can be edited by a designated personnel or filled out again. If the patient's sample information is incomplete or inaccurate, however, it must be recollected. Blood samples for pretransfusion testing should be collected by venipuncture, not from an IV, because these may contain contaminants that may affect testing results. Because hemolysis in blood bank testing confers a positive result, the sample itself should not be hemolyzed. This is often only detectable after centrifuging the specimen. Hemolysis of patient samples only occurs either during collection or within the patient itself. So if the patient does not have intravascular hemolysis or another extenuating circumstance, a new sample should be collected if hemolysis is detected. Pretransfusion samples may be stored refrigerated at 1 to 6 degrees Celsius. Testing must be performed within 72 hours after collection if the patient was either pregnant or received red blood cell products within the last 3 months, or if this information is unknown. Samples must be retained for at least 7 days after transfusion. This means samples should be retained for a total of 10 days. Segments from any transfused units must also be saved. The premise for most blood bank testing is hemagglutination, which is separated into two phases, sensitization and lattice formation. Sensitization is the physical attachment of antibodies to red blood cell antigens and requires immunologic recognition between the antigen and the antibody. The antigenic determinants on the red blood cell surface are randomly paired with antigen binding site on the immunoglobulin molecule. Sensitization is based on an appropriate antibody and antigen ratio, the zone of equivalence. Temperature, IgM antibodies react best at room temperature, while IgG react best at body temperature. The time of incubation, which depends on the reagent or enhancement used. If you incubate for too short of a period of time, there's insufficient time for binding. If you incubate for too long, then you run the risk of dissociation of those antibodies. pH also contributes, and ionic strength. Saline creates an isotonic environment. A lower ionic environment would expedite antibody uptake. Lattice formation occurs when antibody-coated red blood cells collide randomly and create cross-linkages that result in agglutination, or red blood cell clumping. This is affected by the force of repulsion between red cells and saline, called the zeta potential. RBCs have a net negative charge, so they repel each other. The type of molecule, IgM molecules can cause direct agglutination, while IgG molecules need a little bit of help. Lattice formation is achieved via centrifugation of blood bank tubes, forcing antibody-coated cells together. In blood bank testing, there's really only a handful of different types of reagents. We have reagent red blood cells, which often have at least one known antigenic expression. We have reagent antisera, which is commercially prepared concentrations of a known specificity. Then we have anti-human globulin. This stuff helps the IgG-coated red blood cells bind together, permitting lattice formation, which would otherwise not be possible with just the IgG antibodies alone. Paired with the anti-human globulin, or AHG, are check cells, which are IgG-coated reagent red blood cells. These are used to verify that our test system is working correctly. We add these cells to tubes that did not react after initially adding AHG, and expect to see agglutination. A lack of agglutination may indicate that either our AHG isn't working, or maybe it was bound up by some unwashed proteins in our test system. We'll check out a reagent rack on the next slide. So this is what a typical reagent rack looks like in blood bank. In the front row, we usually keep our ABO RH typing sera. So we have anti-A, anti-B. This one has anti-A comma B, which is not as commonly used, but we do have some uses for that. Anti-D, and then at the end there is an inert control, albumin, which we sometimes use to prove that we're not getting non-specific aggregation with some of these reagents. I know you can't see the other rows, but the second row usually contains our A1 and B reagent red cells and a set of 2 or 3 screening cells with known phenotypic expression of all common blood group antigens. And then the third row contains various enhancement media, as well as our AHG and check cells. Tube testing in blood bank works by combining antigen or antibody. One of those is going to be provided by the patient, while the other is provided by a commercially prepared reagent. And then we mix the tubes by gentle agitation and centrifuge them in a serological centrifuge calibrated for this type of testing. This forces any antibody-coated cells close together to form a lattice. Remember, this step, termed immediate spin, is only going to detect IgM molecules because those are the only ones capable of binding without AHG. Many reagent antisera manufacturers have developed IgM versions of their antisera. After centrifugation, we assess the tube for reactivity by gently agitating it under an agglutination viewer. We grade the reaction strength and record it on our paperwork. Some methods will have you incubate the specimen, especially if you need to detect IgG antibodies. We usually incubate at body temperature, 37 Celsius. Some methods will have you centrifuge and grade your tubes right after that incubation phase, while others might just have you skip on to this next step. Often when attempting to detect IgG molecules, we'll need to wash away any unbound antibody. This is most commonly performed using an automated cell washer. After washing, we detect bound antibody by adding AHG, and we centrifuge our tubes and assess them for reactivity. If we have any negative reactions, we need to add check cells, centrifuge again, and then assess our tubes again. A negative reaction with check cells invalidates our entire test, and we have to start over. The process of allowing antibodies to bind during incubation and then washing away any unbound antibodies and then using AHG to detect bound antibodies is termed the indirect antiglobulin test. When you're grading the reactivity in your test tubes, you want to do so immediately after centrifugation. You first want to observe for any hemolysis, and then you're going to gently agitate the tube at a 45-degree angle in front of an agglutination viewer. You're going to grade the reaction according to the chart shown here. So a solid agglutinate, just one large clump, or a couple of very large ones, would be a 4+ reaction. A 3+ reaction would be several large agglutinates. A 2+ reaction is many moderate-sized agglutinates against a clear background, while a 1+ reaction is many smaller agglutinates with a tinged black background, kind of as if not all of the cells were able to find a partner. And finally, a negative reaction will have no agglutination at all, just a smooth mixture of free red blood cells floating around. So before we get into testing performed on the patient, I want to stop and talk about the testing performed by the transfusion service on donor units. Now, the donor collection facility has already performed a bunch of tests that you'll learn about in another lecture, including the patient's ABO and RH type. But in order for the transfusion service to be certain that the label on the red cell components is accurate, we need to repeat the ABO typing. And then if the product is RHD negative, we also need to repeat that testing, anti-D. Note that although the blood supplier has to confirm whether the donor is weak D positive, the transfusion service does not have to confirm this. ABO confirmation of a red blood cell unit is performed by testing a drop of blood diluted to about 3% in saline against commercial reagent anti-A, anti-B, and then if necessary, anti-D. You spin down the tubes in a serologic centrifuge, and then you read the reactions in an agglutination viewer. Record the reaction strengths, and then interpret your findings. This is known as the forward type, the direct detection of A and B antigens on the donor's red blood cells. The RH type works the same way. We add a drop of suspended red blood cells to a drop of anti-D. We spin down the tubes and then read the reactions. If agglutination is detected, then the D antigen is present. If no agglutination is detected, then the D antigen is not present. Remember that with repeat testing of donor units, we really only need to test for the D antigen in RHD negative units, although some facilities will test all units anyway. We also do not need to test for the weak D antigen, which is a test you'll learn about in another lecture. Okay, so before we begin any testing on the patient sample, we should review his or her history. Sometimes antibodies can become evanescent or undetectable by antiglobulin testing. And so for this reason, accurate record keeping and a review of the patient's record is absolutely crucial. A record review should be performed prior to any testing on a recipient and should include a check of the patient's ABO-RH type, checking for any previously identified antibodies or any previous transfusion reactions. Finally, you should always check for special needs for that patient, such as CMV negative or irradiated blood products. Sometimes physicians will order blood products without all of the data in front of them, so if you notice that a patient has previously received irradiated blood products, you must call the physician and make sure that the order is accurate. Once testing is complete, the results can be compared. Blood should not be provided to a patient if a discrepancy exists between the current ABO type and the historical type on file, unless the discrepancy is resolved. So now we can focus back on the patient sample. We want to perform both a forward and reverse ABO type on the patient. The reverse type is basically a confirmation of the forward type, but it can result in discrepancies. A reverse blood type is performed by testing 2 drops of patient plasma against A1 and B reagent red blood cells. These results are compared to the forward type and an interpretation is made. Often facilities will require 2 separate blood types on 2 different samples collected by 2 different people before they will administer blood that is the same type as the recipient. Otherwise, only group O blood will be given. RH testing of the recipient must also be performed, but once again, weak D testing is not necessary because if we have a false negative D typing due to a partial or weak D patient, no harm is going to come to the patient since we're going to be giving, we could give RHD positive patients either D positive or D negative blood. The antibody screen is how we detect what are termed unexpected antibodies to red blood cell antigens. Since ABO antibodies are naturally occurring and expected, this test basically detects any other antibody that may have been developed as a result of patient exposure to foreign antigens. When performing ABO testing, it's imperative that the forward and reverse types correlate with one another. If they don't, then you must perform an ABO discrepancy resolution. Only group O red blood cells may be issued to patients with unresolved ABO discrepancies. To check to see if your forward and reverse types agree with one another, determine if the antibodies that a patient produces would react with the antigens that they are expressing. For example, group A individuals, so those on the first line of this screen here, produce anti-B, which is why we have a 4+ reaction with the group B red blood cells in the reverse type. Fortunately, the forward type shows that the group A patients do not express the B antigen. Otherwise, we would see a reaction with anti-B reagent in this forward type. An antibody screen performed by tube method involves the indirect antiglobulin test using patient plasma and screening cells that demonstrate all known clinically significant blood group antigens. We first allow the patient plasma to incubate with the reagent red blood cells at body temperature. Remember, that's the temperature at which IgG molecules bind best, 37 degrees Celsius. The duration of the incubation can be decreased if we use enhancement media. After incubation, any unbound antibodies are washed away, leaving only red blood cells, and if there's an antibody that corresponds to one of those antigens on the red cell, then those should be bound to the red blood cell and remain bound throughout the washing process. Next, we add AHG, because remember, IgG-bound red blood cells cannot form lattice structures without help. We spin down the tubes, read and record our results using the grading system we talked about earlier. If we have any agglutination at all, then the patient might have a clinically significant alloantibody, and we will have to identify it. Don't forget to add check cells to any negative reactions, or your results are going to be forfeit. The check cells must agglutinate, or you have to repeat the entire process. So which antigens have to be presented on the antibody screen? Between the 3 screening cells used in an antibody screen, sometimes 2, each antigen of the following blood groups must be represented. RH blood group, Kell, Kidd, Duffy, as in FY here, MNS, and then also P1 and Lewis. Antibodies directed against these blood group systems that react at AHG phase or indirect antiglobulin test are said to be clinically significant and capable of causing either a hemolytic transfusion reaction or shortened survival of transfused red blood cells with the corresponding antigen. Depicted on the bottom of this page is an antibody screen antigram. This shows the antigenic expression of each screening cell. So the cells are listed horizontally and the antigens vertically. Note that all of the requisite antigens are present between the three cells. If an antibody is detected, it must be identified. We'll discuss antibody identification in another lecture, but it's still considered part of pretransfusion testing. The ability to detect antibodies hinges largely on the sensitivity of the method being used. There are pros and cons to each method of detecting antibodies. If there was a best method, then everyone would be using that method exclusively. Tube testing sensitivity can be increased by adding enhancement media. This also shortens the amount of incubation time. Low ionic strength saline, or LIS, does this by reducing the zeta potential and steric hindrance to allow more antibodies to bind per cell, enhancing the sensitization stage of hemagglutination, the first stage. Polyethylene glycol, or PEG, is a water-soluble polymer that excludes water molecules from the test system, enhancing both antibody uptake and lattice formation. Unfortunately, PEG is so good at enhancing lattice formation that nonspecific aggregation occurs. For this reason, tubes cannot be read immediately after incubation. Instead, they must be washed and proceed directly to the AHG phase of testing. PEG is considered to be a bit more sensitive than LIS, but it's also a little more susceptible to interference, as in having more false positive reactions. Albumin is very rarely used as an enhancement media by itself these days, although it's commonly found in LIS reagent preparations. Albumin enhances lattice formation by decreasing the distance between cells. Note that this does not decrease the incubation time needed for sensitization. When we aren't using any enhancement media at all with tube method, we call this neat testing. There are two common alternatives to tube testing: gel and solid phase. Both are capable of being automated, which is an obvious huge selling point. They're also both considered to be more sensitive than tube testing, although some claim that PEG in tube is equally sensitive to these methods. The downside is that they're each more susceptible to interference than tube testing. Gel testing involves using microtubes, often arranged on a card like the one shown here on the slide. The microtubes consist of a reaction chamber, that's the large well on top, and a thinner column of dextroacrylamide gel particles. You add a specific amount of patient plasma to a specific amount of 0.8% red blood cell suspension, incubate at 37 degrees Celsius body temperature, then centrifuge the card. There's no wash step in gel testing. If sensitization and lattice formation occurred, then the agglutinates will not be able to pass through the gel column. Larger agglutinates will be stuck along the top of the column, while smaller agglutinates will settle through the column. IgG molecules are detected using gel cards that already have AHG added. You can see the array of reaction strengths on the gel card on this slide. In a negative reaction, all of the cells will travel through the gel column to the bottom. Small agglutinates become trapped in the bottom half of the column as a 1+ reaction. Agglutinates that are trapped throughout the column is a 2+ reaction. A 3+ reaction usually has agglutinates throughout the top half of the column, and a 4+ reaction will not be able to enter the gel column at all. It will be settled on top. Gel testing is excellent for detecting mixed cell populations. The last well shown here is termed a mixed field reaction. This occurs when some cells from a sample react with an antibody while the others do not, usually because one group expresses the antigen while the other doesn't. Solid phase antibody screening is performed on polystyrene wells that have been coated with lysed red blood cell stroma. Patient plasma is added to each well along with a LIS reagent. The wells are incubated and then washed to remove any unbound antibody. After washing, red blood cells coated with anti-IgG are added to the wells. The wells are centrifuged and then read, usually by a camera for reaction strength. If an antibody is present on the patient's plasma against an antigen expressed by the lysed red cell stroma, then the indicator cells, those with the anti-IgG bound, would have bound to the antibody bound to the well. If no antibody has been bound to the well, then the indicator cells will settle to the bottom in a pellet during centrifugation. Solid phase testing can also be performed using donor or patient red blood cells, but these must be lysed first and adhere to the wells. And then finally, we have our last bit of pre-transfusion testing, cross-match testing, which is the process of ensuring serologic compatibility between the patient's plasma and the donor's red blood cells. The sample for the donor's red blood cells must come from a segment attached to the unit. Do not use retention tubes. If a patient has no currently demonstrating antibodies and no history of unexpected antibodies, then an abbreviated cross-match may be performed, such as an immediate spin cross-match, which is it's exactly what it sounds like. You take your patient's plasma and your donor's suspension of your donor's red blood cells, and you spin down in a centrifuge and read for agglutination. Or an electronic cross-match, which simply compares the donor's blood type against the recipient's blood type. If a patient does have a currently demonstrating antibody or a history of unexpected antibodies, then an extended or full cross-match must be performed. An extended cross-match test involves testing the patient's plasma against donor red cells through IAT in the same manner as the antibody screen. It's important to use the same methodology that detected the antibody to perform the cross-match. An extended cross-match may also be performed if a patient has an ABO discrepancy of unknown cause, or during an emergency when an antibody screen has not yet been performed. Sometimes you'll also need to perform an extended cross-match during a transfusion reaction investigation, but that wouldn't necessarily be considered pre-transfusion testing. There are really only two interpretations for a cross-match: compatible or incompatible. Agglutination of donor red cells in patient plasma indicates an incompatible cross-match, while the lack of agglutination indicates a compatible cross-match. However, there are plenty of reasons that we could be getting for discrepant results. A cross-match may be incompatible by a certain method, but compatible by a different one, especially if an interfering substance or a reagent-specific antibody is present. We will discuss these in more detail in another lecture. A patient may even have a negative screen and then an incompatible cross-match. This could be due to the presence of an antibody to low prevalence antigen, which was not present on the screening cells, but is present on the donor cells. Alternatively, the donor cells may express on an antigen more strongly than it was expressing on the screening cells. Donor cells might also already have antibody bound to them as the result of a medication, which would cause a false positive test. And then finally, the patient may have previously undetected ABO type discrepancy, demonstrating anti-A1 or even anti-A or anti-B due to a passively acquired antibody, such as being transfused out of group plasma or platelets. Electronic cross-match uses algorithms called truth tables to compare patients' blood type against the donor and provide a statement of compatibility based solely on ABO-RH blood typing. This method can only be used if the patient does not have any previous or current antibodies or an ABO type discrepancy. In order to perform electronic cross-match, the patient must have a type on file. It can be during the current admission or even the same day, a second current confirmatory type, and a current antibody screen, meaning it was performed within the previous 3 days. Both ABO types may be performed on the same sample by 2 different lab techs as long as the patient identification was verified using an electronic identification or some other process validated to reduce the risk of misidentification. This is a hotly debated topic in blood banking because the testing the same tube doesn't overcome the possibility that you have the wrong patient's blood in the tube to begin with, and, quote, other processes validated to reduce risk of misidentification is kind of vague. I would feel much more comfortable with a process validated to completely eliminate the risk of misidentification. But I digress. Electronic crossmatch is considered an abbreviated crossmatch similar to an immediate spin crossmatch. Abbreviated crossmatches are only intended to detect ABO compatibility. When selecting blood units for a patient, it's important to keep in mind what makes a unit compatible. If the cells are being transfused, then they must be compatible with the patient's antibodies. If plasma is being transfused, it will include naturally occurring ABO antibodies, so it must be compatible with the patient's red blood cells. Since whole blood consists of both plasma and red blood cells, it must be compatible with both the patient's plasma and the patient's red blood cells, meaning it has to be an exact ABO match. As I've already mentioned, red blood cell products must be matched with patient plasma. The chart on this slide indicates what the best choice would be for each blood type, an exact match, and other blood types that would be acceptable for transfusion. Concerning the RHD status of the patient, well, RHD positive individuals may be transfused with either RHD positive or RHD negative red blood cell units. Conversely, RHD negative patients should only receive RHD negative units unless there is an extenuating circumstance, such as a short blood supply, in which case the patient's physician will have to sign for the release of the blood product. Well, what if the patient has unexpected antibodies? What if our antibody screen is positive and we identify a clinically significant antibody? In this instance, we would want to provide red blood cell products that lack the corresponding antigen. The example presented here is if a patient has anti-E, then we would want to provide E-negative red blood cell units. This is the central dogma of basic blood banking. Identify the antibody and provide units that lack the corresponding antigen. Please note that even if the antibody screen is negative and the patient has history of an antibody, we would still provide units that lack the corresponding antigen. Blood group antibodies can decline in titer and become undetectable or evanescent, so we must respect the patient's historical antibody identification. When it comes to selecting plasma products for our patients, we want to make sure that the ABO antibodies in the product are compatible with the patient's red blood cells. We do not typically cross-match plasma products. As for platelet products and cryo, all ABO types are considered acceptable. But if you have a choice, then you should provide products that would be compatible with the patient's red blood cells, since the products contain some plasma and therefore ABO antibodies. Components assigned for transfusion of a patient must be appropriately labeled with a cross-match tag. This tag must be securely fastened to the unit being transfused. Cross-match tags must include the following information: the recipient's full first and last name. If the full first and last name cannot fit on an appropriate label, the facility may have alternative policies for addressing this issue. The recipient's unique identification number. This is the same number that was used to positively identify the patient and his or her sample. The expiration date of the donor unit. This should match the expiration date printed on the full-face ISBT label on the front of the unit. A cross-match interpretation must also be included. Remember, there are only two options, either compatible or incompatible. The tag must also include the initials of the individual who performed the cross-match. The ABO-RH types of both recipient and donor must be recorded on the cross-match tags. And finally, the date of the cross-match testing must also be recorded. Usually a statement of when the cross-match expires is also included with this date. The tag must remain affixed to the unit throughout the duration of the transfusion. The last step that must occur before a unit of blood leaves the laboratory is that the unit must be issued to an individual charged with transporting the blood product. Most often this is the nurse who will be performing the transfusion. First, a visual inspection of the integrity of the unit is essential. Any discoloration or bubbles may indicate bacterial contamination. Leaks or unsecure ports may indicate that sterility has been compromised. Next, verify that all of the information printed on the compatibility tag matches the information presented on the unit. And then finally, verify that you're issuing blood to the correct patient by comparing it to the request provided by the transporter. Compare this to the compatibility tag. Only if everything that you reviewed matches can you release the unit for issue for transfusion. Occasionally, facilities will use a pneumatic tube system. In this case, the onus is with both the lab tech to check the information presented on requested tube down to the lab and with the person transfusing the blood. All these steps are going to be repeated again at the point of transfusion, whether it's pneumatic tube or not, along with other steps like taking the patient's vitals, but that's information for another lecture. Sometimes a unit of blood cannot be transfused after issuance and is returned to the blood bank. Upon receipt, the temperature of the unit must be checked and recorded, along with the date and time of the return. The component must be inspected again. As long as the unit remained within 1 to 10 degrees Celsius, the ports remain intact, and at least one sealed segment remains attached to the unit. That unit will be eligible for reissue, either to the same patient or even to a different one. Otherwise, the unit must be quarantined until it can be discarded. We've reached the end of the lecture. We're going to go back over the objectives to make sure that we hit all of our key points here. It would be beneficial to pause the playback before I review each of these to allow yourself some time to reflect on the concept and see what you can remember. The first objective is to explain the purpose of pretransfusion testing. Remember, we want to provide components that will have an acceptable survival rate once transfused and not cause any harm to the patient. Next, list the necessary information on a blood product transfusion request form. We need the complete first and last name, a unique ID number for minimal positive identification, and then an indication of what's being requested. What about the blood sample? What's required on that? Again, we need complete first and last name along with a unique ID number. We also need a date of the sample collection because that's how we determine how long the crossmatch is acceptable. And we need some sort of documentation of who collected the sample. Most often this is done by having the collector write his or her initials on the tube. What's the preferred type of sample for blood bank testing? EDTA whole blood. You're going to use this for virtually all blood bank testing. It's usually spun down first so that you can separate the cells from the plasma. Which tests must be repeated for donor units once received by the transfusion facility? We need the forward ABO and RH if the unit, the forward ABO and then the RH if the unit is labeled RHD negative. What about weak D? Do we need to do that? No, not necessary on the repeat testing for donor. What about on a patient sample? We need an ABO with forward and reverse because we actually have plasma available, and we need to know if the patient has, an ABO discrepancy. Maybe they've got some anti-A or anti-B in their plasma that might cause a discrepancy. We also need an antibody screen, and then if the antibody screen is positive, we'll need to perform antibody identification. We're going to go on to the next objectives on the next slide. Continuing with our objectives here, why is it important to review the patient's history? The two main reasons are to help ensure that we have the correct patient by comparing blood types, and then also we want to know if the patient has any previously identified antibodies because they can become evanescent or undetectable by our antibody screen, and yet they still run the risk of producing an immune response. We'd also want to know if they have any special needs, such as irradiated or CMV negative products, or if they have history of transfusion reactions, all of those things. Which blood groups must be expressed on our antibody screen? This is a tough one to remember. The more you're exposed to them, the more likely you are to remember each of them. You've got the RH system, the KEL system, the KID system, Duffy, MNS, P1, and Lewis. Even though those last ones, P1 and Lewis, are almost never clinically significant, they still must be included. All right, what were the different enhancement media that we had? And we had LIS that increased antibody uptake by reducing the zeta potential and also reducing steric hindrance. We had PEG, which increased both the uptake and lattice formation by excluding water molecules. And then we had albumin. I mentioned that's almost never used by itself, but that enhances lattice formation by allowing cells to become closer together. What about gel? How did that work? And what about solid phase? Okay, so remember, these are both indirect antiglobulin techniques. Gel works by incubating patient plasma and cells in a reaction chamber and then spinning them down with no wash step. The agglutinates are not going to be able to traverse through the gel particles, so positive reactions get stuck towards the top or throughout the gel column, while negatives fall straight through the gel. And then solid phase involved incubating the patient plasma with Lys enhancement in a polystyrene well that's already coated with screening cell stroma. It's been lysed and adhered to the sides of the well. After an incubation period, any unbound antibodies are washed away, and then indicator cells are added. Remember, those are the red blood cells coated with AHD. After centrifugation, the wells are evaluated. A diffuse pattern means that the indicator cells have bound to the antibodies that were bound to the antigens on the side of the well. A pellet forming at the bottom of the well means that no antibodies are present. All right, what do we need to have in order to perform an abbreviated cross-match? Remember that abbreviated cross-matches only detect ABO incompatibility or compatibility. We need a negative current antibody screen and a current ABO RH type. We also need no history of an antibody. An electronic cross-match requires 2 ABO RH types on file. Many facilities may not even give non-O blood unless the patient has 2 types on file. How do we select which type of red blood cell components to use? Well, we want to use red blood cells that lack the antigens corresponding to the patient's antibodies. So a group A patient should not be given group B or AB cells because they have anti-B in their plasma. And then what about plasma products? We want to make sure that plasma products lack the antibodies that correspond to the patient's antigens. So a group A patient should only receive A plasma or AB plasma because those groups lack anti-A. Okay, what information do we have to have on a compatibility tag? It's a long list to remember. So there's everything we already discussed on the request and sample and the compatibility tag. All of those need complete first and last name and a unique identification number. The tag also needs to have the donor unit number, the expiration date of the unit, the interpretation of the crossmatch, compatible or incompatible, the initials of the tech who performed the crossmatch, ABO-RH of both the recipient and the donor, and then the date of the crossmatch testing, sometimes along with the crossmatch expiration. So that's it for this presentation. I hope you were able to remember most of the stuff from the objectives. If not, you can just go back to the slides and review anything you might have missed. Hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to teaching you antibody identification. I think for you it's going to be next week. Good luck.